So a very provocative set of messages, which I'm going to try to prioritise how we can derive hope and be constructive. So I'll just say that as an underlying thing, rather than going through again a sort of a diagnosis of where we're falling short, because I think that's just very appropriate for the Vincent de Paul Society. But I do want to take you up on what you just said then, that first and foremost, your imagination of the church is as an oasis of hope and good news. Now, when lay people hear that, I think that it's quite a mixed message in some ways, because I think we've been led to believe that we will be given that, if you know what I mean, that we'll follow somebody giving us hope and good news, even if we don't say this out loud. Whereas my instinct is that it's going to have to come from the lay people themselves. So they're going to have to really believe in their own sense of hope and good news, which might feel, until they practice it, rather second rate, dare I say, because it hasn't been given almost the imprimatur quotes of a blessing from the hierarchy or from the people whom they traditionally took their instructions from. I know that loads of people here might say, no, I'm well beyond that, but I actually think that it does lurk there, a lack of belief in the lay people themselves, that the sort of conclusions they're drawing about where we have to go, they have to win that argument. You know, they don't feel they're properly listened to. Now, are you conscious of this as a member of the hierarchy, as a bishop? Do you open your mind to lay people's diagnosis?
Geraldine, I think some Catholics would have that kind of traditional mentality of, pray and pay and obey. That would be a somewhat infantilizing description of the faith of some ordinary Catholic people, but I think it holds true still for some. But I think that doesn't mean that that should hold, because we on this side of the social revolution now. It's the age of the laity, as some are fond of saying. The church is not just the church of the ordained. The church is not, Father says it, Father knows it better than anyone else, So there is a sense that we have to move to a more adult faith, and taking ownership of our very baptismal identity and mission. So when I use that phrase, the church must be an oasis of hope and good news, I mean to say that that's what Jesus came to tell us and to share with us in his very ministry, and therefore, as followers, as Christians, we have that mandate to be the church that reflects the presence of Christ. We're in that business of making the kingdom of God present as a reality, just as the covenanted people of old made that mandate, or tried to make that mandate a reality in their circumstances.
In a funny sort of a way, I agree with you, of course. I totally agree with you. But sometimes I think that lay people have to be invited by each other, as opposed to church officials, to examine the virtue and the kindness that they sense in their own secular world. Because I've said for a while that I actually think the secular world has become often a much kinder, gentler place than the essence of the church, which is a terrible thing to say. It's not something I don't enjoy saying at all. And in a way, there has to be a real gracious acceptance that often what we might have seen in our own organisations and in our own world is a much more something to copy than anything that we've seen in the church of late.
Well, I don't believe that we should see the church as an enemy. You know, in the past there was this narrative, that classic characterization of the world as the enemy. You know, the flesh, the devil, and the world are the three enemies. But Vatican II gave us another vision. You know, the world is not an enemy, because this world is where God chose to make his home by sending his Son, you know, among us. So we talk about being fellow pilgrims with the people of the world, rather than you know, we in this ship that everyone else who is not found on board is destined to damnation. So we don't we no longer ascribe or subscribe to that antagonistic, hostile view of the world. But at the same time, having said that, you know, we don't see ourselves as having no business of transforming the world either, because our mission is precisely to transform the world according to the vision of the kingdom that Jesus gave us. I agree that you know, the lay people need to be need to take responsibility, need to rise up, as it were, and take their Christian identity and mission seriously. But there is also a sense that the leaders who have the power need to facilitate and empower.
Leaders in the church, in a hierarchy, or in the later?
In the hierarchical structure of the church, need to empower the laity to take ownership and responsibility of building up the kingdom.
Tell me what it's like looking at the laity from a church hierarchy, man of the hierarchy, looking on. Now, I'm really intrigued to know, do you wish, and is the conversation amongst you, I wish they would take more responsibility, or they're annoying me because they want to take too much? Like, what's the view about the laity at the moment?
Well, I can't speak for others, but I love that saying of St. Augustine, you know, with you I am a Christian, and for you I am a bishop. You know, our common identity is our baptism, and that is the guiding, the prevailing identity, you know. And I believe that you know, we need to shake off that Constantinian Christianity, and by that I mean you know, when Constantine made Christianity an official religion of the Roman Empire, he created that clerical class as analogous to the Roman political system, and that is not necessarily part of the gospel, so there is a need on the part of the ordained or the bishops, especially like myself, to to really identify myself as member of the community and creating a community of disciples rather than that pyramid top down.
So a sort of a real assistance, because that's what I have to say I don't hear enough of. I want to hear words like, we are here to observe you and to help you come to your best, drawing from the world and actually having a virtuous loop with the church that so needs the help of the world. I mean, that's how I.
Well, the power that Jesus conceived is a power not over people, but a power to enable people to be who they can be in the sight of God, and I think that's critical, especially for people in positions of leadership, which is why I choose to fly with Tiger Airways, for instance, just to embed myself in that culture of minority, humility.
Yes, I mean, it just a little sort of observation that I think was a piece that I read recently about, I think it was a nun, some of you may have read this, who gave an interview to L'Osservatore Romano about what they were saying, is it almost like a Me Too movement in the Vatican? She was belling the cat on the terrible treatment of a lot of the female religious who were serving, they really were, I don't mean sexual abuse, I'm talking about just disrespect, treating them like almost servants, you know, almost of a Victorian era, upstairs and downstairs.
The virus of misogyny that...
Well, it was absolutely the virus of misogyny, but it was like an endemic, I mean, it's just inconceivable to me, if you know what I mean, in my secular organisations, in the media, for goodness sake, you know, hardly the most saintly place, that would occur. And so, you know, the gulf, that's what I'm trying to get at, the gulf between some of the secular organisations which are held up and looked at, quite rightly, for falling short, you know, they look a heck of a lot better in many ways than that's a total lack of kindness, a total lack of charity, and very much not seeing those women serving them and just picking and fetching and carrying.
And yet, you know, we have a right to dress up as that kind of mistreatment of women and even women religious as you know, an ecclesiology, yes, or as divinely ordained way of being church. I mean, it's ludicrous in this day and age that an organization, let alone an organization that claims to be a guiding light for the world to, you know, to subject women to that kind of level of subservience. Yes, and I lived in Rome for 5 years, and even as recently as 2008, or where I last lived, you know, most religious orders, male religious orders, I should clarify, were staffed by nuns, and nuns who did their laundry, their meals, their housekeeping. I mean, it's just insane. Yet it's happening, and you know, some religious women saw the light and abandoned that a long time ago. But you know, they're nuns from Africa and you know, Vietnam and the Philippines, who would consider an honor to serve in a house of a cardinal or the house of a bishop, you know, and they know how many cardinals and bishops there are in Rome. there is something inconsistent there. There's something that you could see as a travesty of the gospel.
So, what do we, listening in to that, because it's a travesty, I think you're quite right, what would you like the people who are so active, remarkably so, in St Vincent de Paul? You know, you've got some of the most active people in the church. What do you want to imbue them with? How would you like them to take up the authority that clearly they're going to have to?
Well, the church doesn't have to be this way. That is what I would say to them. You know, when you see that something that is incongruent with the gospel message of peace, of inclusion. You know, I like that story I told about the Canaanite woman and Jesus. You know, so often we don't read that in the sense of a woman challenging the privileged male who was Jesus, who held exclusionary views of race and gender, you know, and Jesus praised the woman for her courage, and I think we, as people of God, need to first of all espouse the gospel values. Let it permeate our identity, our who we are, and then on the basis of that we can exercise our mission to change the world, to transform the world, to make the world into the reflection of the kingdom.
And if they meet opposition or ambivalence from the people who've traditionally seen themselves as leaders, what do they do with that? Like, in other words, if they start to to grasp this notion that I think is around, and you're inviting us to, that they are going to have to carry the torch and reframe the whole message and search themselves and, you know, search their conscience. But they are challenging traditional authority. How do you deal? Because that mightn't be nice all the time.
Yes, well, the challenge comes from both sides, and you know, as a bishop, I am well aware of my view being challenged by different quarters, even within my constituency.
Are you? No, seriously?
Yes, yes. I when I first came to my diocese, I gave a lecture on the challenges of the church in the papacy of Pope Francis. And one of the things I said was that we should learn to be an inclusive church where everyone, no matter what their social background, sexual orientation, feel at home and not excluded. And the next day, I saw an online petition to have me removed. So I'm used to that kind of criticism, but that doesn't mean that, you know, I have nothing to learn from people who criticize me or even oppose me. I would be short-sighted or even foolish if I did that. You have to take everything with a grain of salt. But I think the prophetic spirit which characterize the lives and the activities of people like Frederic Ozanam inspires us to aim for the best, to aim for the church that is truly authentic and true to the gospel message.
I suppose I'll make this my final question, but in terms of people sensing that maybe they don't feel supported sufficiently, because there'll be people here there aren't terribly many people, young people around, in terms of getting the next generation in, and they may feel that they're out there labouring on their own in this rather hostile world, as Sue was talking about earlier. Again, I wonder what your sense is as to how they can fortify themselves. You've suggested that we must be careful it doesn't become just another very, very compassionate NGO, that it has to have something special. I think everybody knows in theory you're right, but it's the durability of that message. It's sallying forth when you've got that 60%, but you're a little bit shaky, and you're just not sure that you've got the full backing of the church, or you think the church itself is just so brittle at the moment that it's quite a tough road to hoe. Setting up their own field hospital, in a sense. I mean, people must come to you with this, I'm sure.
Well, I think there's a saying in Paul's letter that we need to be open to the Spirit, but also test every spirit, and so the opposition and criticism that we receive as a result of our stand for justice, for inclusion, for equality, is a price to pay, but also we need to be humbled and purified and refined in our endeavor to be the catalyst for the renewal, because there are aspects of your vision that might need to be fine-tuned, that might need to be critiqued in a way that make.
So don't be smug.
Yeah, so that's right, and to be humble and to have that that ability to learn from all quarters. That would be.
Humility doesn't mean passivity. It's a very it's a tricky message. Look, Julie invited me to just give my own sort of little summation, and I've been listening to you a great deal and thinking about this ever since we first started talking about this. And I talked about this at the Catholic Social Services Conference a few weeks back here in Victoria. And I think there are about 5 things that I take with me now. That whole Rabbi Jonathan Sacks exhortation, the former chief rabbi of the UK, belong before believe, bring that whole sort of sensibility, which I think the Vincent de Paul could very much embody, that notion of belonging and then believing, drawing people into that sense of who they are, and with that amazing confidence that can give. I'm a huge believer in the sort of confidence and conviction is such a wonderful calling card. You can't manufacture it, it's got to be there. So I'd say belong but not believe, before believe. Don't let the best be the enemy of the good, because a lot of the invitation for us to think creatively and seriously, you start to do so and you think, well, I'll never achieve that. So I'll just go back. I'll just sit back and wait. And I really believe, and that's certainly not what Frederic Ozanam did from what I can read. He set off knowing he didn't have the final set of answers, but following some sort of prophetic sense. And I personally think that's the way lay people are going to have to think. Don't be a sad sack about it all. The priest at our local priest, Father Phil Linder, gave a very good sermon on Easter Sunday, saying just simply, don't be a sad sack. Anything you want to do, don't be a sad sack about it, which of course Pope Francis has very much talked about precisely that whole notion, that terrible pessimism, that greyness, you know, as if that's going to attract anybody. Sourpuss, exactly. I think this searching for the virtue and the kindness in your own worlds, in our own worlds, and then applying it to the church. Now, that sounds easy. That's quite a revolutionary act in many ways, to almost prioritise some of the practices that you've seen that might look very procedural, you know, about who sits on appointment committees, how people are addressed, the bullying, the practices of reporting bullying, all those sorts of things. They're all often full of virtue, I would argue, full of virtue. And I think that they could be looked at and applied to this church of ours and with pride. And finally, you know, I've been thinking about this. I think especially with people like yourselves who are doing such fantastic work. So the expression of charity and Jesus' words are being enacted, but the words often aren't there to describe it. And this is another thing that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks talks about, which is a genius of the Jewish tradition, that they find words to convey a beliefs or prophetic sense. And I don't think we do it well enough. And I invite you all to actually ponder why you do what you do, to write it down, possibly to write it for other outlets so that young people can hear. That you're not just, it's not just a reactive thing, it's embodied in a broader sense of the way you see your world and your commitment to it. And I feel that, so we've got the actions, I think, strangely enough. We haven't got the words to restate the purpose that we've inherited, this great tradition we've inherited. So I would say those 5 things, and so that we can't be, in fact, oddly enough, I suppose, in a way, it is the antithesis, you know, Frederic Ozanam, all the Catholics in France, all talk, no action. Well, I'm actually saying I want a bit more talk. I want a bit more talk and reflection on why we do what we do, because I think that is the way to rescue the Catholic brand. Bishop Long, that was fantastic. Thank you very, very much, and I really do.